All right, we are going to go ahead and start. Um, Thank you for everyone who is watching this webinar, whether you are watching live through Zoom right now or live through Facebook. We're streaming this in two places at once, or if you're watching it after the fact, after it's been previously recorded, welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Rachel Felling. I am a naturalist for the Zionsville Parks and Recreation Department in Zionsville, Indiana, which is just outside of Indianapolis, if you're not familiar. And this webinar is Bites, Stings, and Rashes, the less fun side of nature. So the whole premise of this webinar is to give people some information, to educate people, to help you feel more equipped and well prepared to be outdoors. As a naturalist working in a parks department, I get tons of questions all the time. Sometimes, when I'm out at a program, just from people that stop in, or people will send us messages through our social media channels. They'll tag me in something and they'll ask about these things. And we realize that there's a lot of fear around certain creatures, certain plants. There's also a lot of misinformation out there. You'll see a lot of like clickbaity type headlines, things that are really just scare tactics. Conversation, they get a lot of clicks, they get a lot of interest, so you'll see things. And people are rightfully so nervous about different things, so we understand that. And so that's why I wanted to do this webinar, because generally most fears people have about certain creatures are overblown a little bit. Some are right-sized, but anytime you can give people the information they need to take care of themselves, I think that you're in a much better place. So, even the plants or creatures that you may need to really be aware of and stay away from, having the info to understand, okay, where am I likely to see it? How can I prevent it? And what should I look for? Should I encounter it? I think is really, really important to help reduce those fears. So that is my goal today. I highly encourage people to throw questions into our chat feature. If you're on Zoom, if you are on Facebook, put it in the comments. I may not see the Facebook Q&A questions until after this is wrapped up, at which point I will add my responses and answers in, just because I can't switch between the two screens at once. It's hard to do with Zoom screen share and Facebook live streaming. But please put them there and we will do our very best to get your questions answered. And let's get into this. So the way this is going to be structured is I have just a little bit of disclaimer, things you should know up front, and then we're going to get into each creature or plant that we want to talk about. We'll start with plants and then we'll go to animals that are likely to cause these bites, stings, rashes, or other types of illnesses, things that you want to avoid. And for each one, we're going to talk about how likely are you to actually encounter this thing? Because sometimes it may seem like this certain creature is actually a big problem, but in all reality, you probably won't run into it very often. But on the flip side, there are some things that most people should know about that very few people do. So we're going to talk about those. And then what is the typical severity should you actually encounter it? And what are some things we can do to prevent it, things you should know? So that's what we're going to get into today. Feel free to take screenshots as we're on here. I can email these slides out to anybody that's interested. Throw the questions in the Q&A or in the Facebook comments, and we will get to them. So first off, come on. All right, disclaimer, I'm not a doctor, never have been a doctor, never claimed to be a doctor, did not go to medical school. I am a naturalist, so I am not here or able to give, one-on-one specific medical advice to anybody. I would not be your person for that, but I'm going to share what you might typically see or experience. But always, always, if you are in doubt, if you have questions, if you're experiencing symptoms of something, talk to a medical professional right away, because that is not who I am. So, I can tell you what creatures might bite you, but if you show me a bite, that's not what I'm here for. So I don't want to ever, have any doubt on that. And I want to educate people. I hope I don't scare you. My goal is that you walk away feeling well equipped to understand what is around you and identify some of these things and not afraid to go outside. And so the other thing to remember is people have various reactions to lots and lots of different things. There are some very common allergens that lots of us have a typical reaction to. And then there's always going to be somebody or some subset of people who have more extreme reactions to it, right? Like most people can eat peanuts, but for some people, if they eat peanuts, they are really in trouble. For most of us, if we get stung by a yellow jacket, it's just going to hurt a lot and be very annoying. But for some subset of people, if they get stung by a yellow jacket, they need to go to an emergency room. So everybody's reaction to things varies. And there are, common plants that most people have no reaction to whatsoever, but there's always going to be somebody that has some sort of allergic response. So keep that in mind. And even the things, like I said, that you are not likely to have a reaction to, nothing is impossible. Nothing at all. Everything is possible. And if in doubt, leave it alone. If a plant or animal seems like it may be dangerous in some way, just leave it alone. Take a picture of it and then try to identify it later. Don't, pick it up and just see what happens. But if in doubt, leave it alone. And if in doubt about the physical symptom you're experiencing, talk to a medical professional. And then finally, some things to keep in mind before we get into the specific plants and animals here. This is not inclusive of all things that could cause a reaction, right? I could teach this as a semester-long college course if that's what we wanted to do. We are going to go over some of the most common, most likely ones that you'll encounter, and the ones that I get the most questions about, even if they are less common. The things people seem to think that they need to worry about. This information is specific to Central Indiana. We're putting this out on the internet. If you happen to be watching this from South Carolina, from Arizona, from, New England, your information will vary a little bit. Generally, the further north you go, you're not going to get more venomous creatures. The further south you go, you do get more venomous and dangerous creatures. So this is specific to our area. And then finally, the chances of encountering some of the things that we're going to talk about today vary a lot depending on the season, right? Like we're in September, we're at the end of summer, very early fall. Obviously, you're going to run into some things this time of year that you're not going to see out in January and February. So for those that have, more timing dependent chances of encountering, I'm going to try to talk about that as much as I can. So just a few things to keep in mind. This is actually a great time of year to talk about these things because for the most part, not all, but most of the things that we're going to talk about are the end of the summer is when you're most likely to encounter them. Not all of them, but a lot of them are a little more heightened at this time of year. So let's get into it. We're going to start with plants. I'm going to go through a few plants that you might have a reaction to if you encounter. And the first one is one that I'd like to think that we've all got pretty well down, but let's talk about it. Poison ivy. So you may have heard the old adage, leaves of 3, let it be. I think that's like taught to most scout kids and just young kids in general, but leaves of 3, let it be. So your chance of encountering poison ivy is very high in Central Indiana. You can be out in, one of our local parks. You could be in your yard. You could be, in your garden, at a school, in their garden beds. Poison ivy is around. It is a native plant. It is supposed to be here, okay? Your reaction severity, this one varies quite a bit. So let's first talk about how to identify poison ivy, and then we'll talk about how and why it causes a reaction for people. So like I said, leaves of 3, let it be. In the top left picture, you can see some poison ivy growing right along a sidewalk. It typically presents with 3 leaves in sort of a triangle shape. The bottom 2 leaves are parallel to each other, and they have these little thumbs, typically. I like to compare it to like a mitten shape, and then that third leaf points straight out away from them. The leaves can be tiny, they can be large, depends on the plant. It is actually a vine, and that's what you see in the lower right-hand corner. It has this hairy appearing vine. And all parts of the plant can carry the oil that causes a reaction. So, like I said, there's this oil on it. It's called urushiol oil. It's a mouthful. And it's an allergen that some people react to. And it is an allergen, like many, that the more exposure you have to it over time, the more likely you are to actually have a reaction. So you'll often hear people say, well, I'm not allergic to poison ivy. It doesn't do anything to me. Kids tell me this all the time. I don't get poison ivy. And it's like, yet. You don't get poison ivy yet. But that doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. It can definitely change as you get older, the more exposed you are to it. I didn't get poison ivy for the first time until I was probably 25, 26 years old. And I still don't get it very bad. When I get it, I get the typical small blisters, and that's usually what poison ivy reaction looks like. Tiny little blistery rash. They really do look like these little pinpoint blisters, sometimes a little larger than a pinpoint, and they itch like crazy. So if you've encountered the oil, maybe you were out pulling some weeds in your garden, or you were out for a hike and you brush up against the leaves or that vine, the oil from it gets onto your skin, causes the reaction. Or the oil can get on your clothes, and then later you touch your clothes and it causes a reaction. Or your dog runs through a patch of poison ivy, gets the oil on his fur, and then you pet your dog later, and then it causes a reaction. That's one of the many ways that people get it. Pets, or dogs especially, are well known for bringing it in. So there's a few different ways. If you know that you've been exposed to it on your skin, there is like a couple different over-the-counter poison ivy specific soaps that you can buy, that if you know that you touched it, you know you were around it, you can wash with these soaps right away to help remove the oil. So people that are highly allergic to poison ivy sometimes keep this in their medicine cabinet. Short of that, use dish soap. Hand soap doesn't work as well because hand soap doesn't remove oils very much, right? Like our hand soap, body soaps, oils are usually good for not drying out our skin, so they try not to remove those, but dish soap is designed to remove oil. So using dish soap to wash off where you've been exposed is a good way to get it. Now, depending on how long it's been on your skin and your reaction sensitivity, may be too late. Once the blisters do appear, you can treat it with any kind of anti-itch, a calamine lotion, hydrocortisone cream, Benadryl cream, things like that to help calm you down. And those who have severe reactions, generally they know, they've had the reactions before, but there's always a first time. My husband gets it. He usually ends up having to go and get a steroid shot because he gets it so bad. And I know a few people that are like that, where their whole body kind of breaks out into hives along with the poison ivy spots. And it can be really, really dangerous and, more than just annoying. And then finally, poison ivy is often confused with Virginia creeper, which is another low-growing ground vine that will sometimes go up trees. So in the bottom left of your screen, you see Virginia creeper and poison ivy side by side. So poison ivy is the leaves of 3, let it be. Virginia creeper has 5 leaves. They are similar in size, similar in color, grow in the same habitat. Some people who have high sensitivity to poison ivy will also react to Virginia creeper. They're in the same family, but Virginia creeper is not nearly as potent. I don't react to Virginia creeper at all, but just know that if you're out and you're like, I'm sure it was Virginia creeper I was pulling, not poison ivy, and you end up with a rash, it may be from the Virginia creeper. Again, they're both native. In our parks, we leave poison ivy because it is a native plant that produces berries that are super beneficial for birds. We will sometimes spray it or trim it if it's growing, onto a main pathway, or obviously if it's near a playground or something. But if it's just off in the woods here in the parks, we leave it because, again, it's a native. If you do need to get rid of it, wearing good gloves and pulling it is the best way to do it. If you are somebody that has high sensitivity to it, get somebody else to do it for you. It's not worth the risk, but gloves, long sleeves, and then washing with dish soap afterwards. Don't burn poison ivy. This is the case for many plants with toxic components to it, because that oil, as it's burned, can go out in the smoke, and if you have a reaction to it, you happen to inhale some of that, could cause an internal response. So don't burn any plants with toxins is a pretty good rule of thumb. Just protect yourself in general. So, all right, let's move on to another one. This is another one I bet you've encountered, but not everybody knows this one. Stinging nettles. So stinging nettle your chances of encountering are high. Lots of it growing around. See it all over our parks, see it in different wooded areas, around wetland areas. So high chance of encountering, but your reaction severity is usually mild. Again, I'm sure there's somebody that is going to have a severe reaction to this, but it's typically very mild and it's fast, meaning the reaction is going to be, it's going to happen fast and then going to be done. So what causes stinging nettle to be problematic are those little hairs on it. And you can see them really, really well in that top left picture. When you touch the plant, those tiny little hairs get released. They're not actual hair, but a filament, and they get into your skin, and it, as the name would suggest, stings quite a bit. I think it burns is how I describe it. And for me personally, it is pretty intense right away for about 2, 3, 4 minutes, and then you barely remember that it ever happened. If you went and rolled around in a huge patch of it, be a different story. But this is like, you know, I'm trying to reach for something and I rub up against it. That's where I see stinging nettle and I get it on my skin and it's like, ah, but then it's fine afterwards. You usually see this in wet areas, wooded areas as well too. So it can grow 3, 4 feet tall, occasionally a little taller, but typically 3, 4 feet tall. The leaves are heavily toothed, is what we call that, where you see the jagged edges on the teeth, but the hairs are pretty unmistakable, and the hairs are on both the stems and the leaves, so you don't want to touch any part of it. Now, interestingly enough, stinging nettle has a ton of medicinal properties, dating back literally thousands of years of using nettle for treatment. The leaves have to be boiled and blanched, but after that, it's used to treat a whole host of things, from like stomach problems to joint pain to headaches to any number of things. So it's a really important plant. Again, you'll see this in the parks. It's common. If you're rubbed up against stinging nettle, you know right away usually. But for most of us, it's a one and done, and then you feel fine afterwards. All right, so this next one is of growing concern here in central Indiana, and one that I really want to make sure that we educate the public on, that is a newer growing threat. So poison hemlock is a non-native invasive plant that has been spreading significantly in the past few years. So your chance of encountering poison hemlock is unfortunately gotten quite high. It used to be that you were only going to encounter poison hemlock in like a highly disturbed area. So I'm thinking like, you know, an old farm field that somebody let go, didn't plant, that kind of thing, roadside ditches. Those were the places you were seeing poison hemlock for a long time. In the past few years, it has really expanded out of those disturbed areas and into parks, yards, suburban areas, and it's just popping up everywhere. The reaction severity to poison hemlock can be mild, but it can also be severe. Really kind of depends on what your interaction is with it. So why is poison hemlock bad? So all parts of the plant are extremely toxic: the leaves, the flowers, the stems, the roots, all parts. If you ingest it, you are going to get extremely sick extremely fast. Now, luckily, most of us aren't out eating plants. It can be a big problem for livestock though, especially if they don't have good access to other fresh food and this is all that's left. They can eat it and it can kill them or cause severe problems. So definitely not anything you want to ingest, but even just handling it or breathing it in, if you're handling it, can cause a lot of skin irritation and even breathing problems. So you want to be really, really careful with this one. So how do I identify poison hemlock? It is in the same family as Queen Anne's lace. which we see a lot this time of year. It's kind of done flowering at this point, but Queen Anne's lace has a nice big white flower, very elegant looking mini flower that you see along roadsides this time of year. Some people raise it in their gardens because it's a host plant for black swallowtails. So Queen Anne's lace and poison hemlock are in the same family. There's a couple other ones that are in this family as well. Wild parsnip is one of them. But poison hemlock is different and can be identified in a couple ways. And the number one identification feature for poison hemlock is that splotchy purple stem that you see in the upper left picture. There's also no hairs on the stem. It's a very smooth stem. Queen Anne's lace is kind of hairy and no purple. And then the flowers you see, instead of being one big round flower, it's got these little offshoot flowers in kind of almost like a ball pattern, or firework pattern is what I like to think of it, how I would describe it. But the most typical time you're going to see it and identify it easily is actually in the early spring. Doesn't mean it's not growing right now, but in early spring, it shoots up. And I shouldn't say real early spring. I'm thinking like May is when you see it shoot up, and it can be 4, 5, 6, 7 feet tall. And with that purple splotchy stem, especially if you start looking for it next spring along roadsides, along farm fields that, you know, are all over here in central Indiana, that is when you're going to notice it a lot. So if you're going to remove it, you need to be really careful. Poison hemlock is interesting because it's what we call a biennial. So most plants that we're familiar with are either annuals or perennials, right? An annual blooms for 1 year and it's done, doesn't come back. You have to reseed to get it to come back the next year. A perennial comes back year after year after year. A biennial has a 2-year cycle. So that's interesting about poison hemlock. The first year, you're mostly just going to see the leaves, which is what you see in that bottom right picture, in kind of a circular pattern close to the ground. That's first year, and that's when it's the easiest to remove. Okay, cut it down and then spray it, kill it, get rid of it. When it shoots up the second year, that's the second year of its life cycle, and that's when it flowers and goes to seed. So by this point in the year, it's gone to seed, and when it goes to seed, it's not just 1, 2, 3, 4 seeds, it's thousands. So cutting it this time of year, trying to mow over it, is actually really not advised because it spreads the seeds so much. It's better to try to kill it earlier in the year before it flowers and goes to seed. So if you have it, you can try to mow it. I would not do a lot of pulling it with your hands. If you do, you need to wear gloves. I would wear a breathing mask as well. I mean, there was a story that kind of made the rounds of a man, I believe he was in Ohio, who was pulling a bunch of it out of his garden and was inhaling some of it as he was pulling it, and ended up in the hospital. Nearly died, had such a severe reaction. So it's one that you just really need to be really careful about. If you're not sure what it is, take some pictures. Might be a time to call in some professional help for this one, especially if it's well established. It's just 1 or 2 plants. Try to get rid of it in that first year, and then hopefully it doesn't spread. But yeah, look for it in the springtime. And this is one of those big ones that we're seeing come up more and more. I know our maintenance team here for the Zionsville Parks Department has been busy trying to get rid of it within our parks and to get rid of it safely. We don't always advocate for spraying, weed killer, but this is one that spraying weed killer is a safer route than trying to dig it up or pull it up. Safer for us as people to kill it. So that is what we would recommend. All right, next one we're going to talk about blue-green algae. This is an interesting one, and one that you may or may not be familiar with. I think people have different kind of varying degrees of familiarity with blue-green algae, especially depending on if you're spending summers on lakes. So your chance of encountering this blue-green algae, also, which is truly a type of cyanobacteria, is medium to high in late summer. What is your reaction severity? Well, it affects pets and people, and it can be mild to severe. It's going to be more severe for pets, and we'll talk about why in a second, specifically dogs, and more severe for anyone with compromised immune system, young kids, older people, things like that is going to cause a problem. So what is it? You probably have heard of algae blooms at this point. And what happens is it's not actually an algae. It's, like I said, it's a photosynthetic bacteria. Photosynthetic meaning it uses photosynthesis like plants, but it's bacteria, not plant. Really kind of an interesting biological creature we've got going here. And as it does that, the bacteria release these toxins, okay? So they bloom, meaning they spread in these huge numbers when you have a combination of warm water and high nutrient levels. We often think nutrient levels, like, that's good, right? Nutrients are good. You can't have too much of a good thing, but that's not the case when it comes to nutrient levels, especially in water. So when we say nutrient levels, we're talking about, nitrogens, phosphorus that have run off from farm fields, that have run off from people spraying fertilizers on their yards and their plants, and then it rains and the water runs down to our streams and then into our waterways and to our lakes. And especially as we get towards this time of year, from late summer to early fall, when the water's gotten nice and warm all summer, it is prime conditions for an algae bloom. And so that's what happens when this comes up. So the way to identify this algae bloom is not just green in the water, right? There's actual algae, which is a plant that grows naturally in water. It's part of the food chain. It's important to have, okay? Blue-green algae, this cyanobacteria, is different, okay? And the way that it's described and the way I would tell people to look at it is it's like pea soup, right? It's part of the water. So algae, the plant that we need and is beneficial, if I were to scoop my hand in the water, I'd get little stringy plants off of my hands. That is the good stuff. That's algae, that's a plant that's growing. This cyanobacteria, this blue-green algae, if it's in the water and I scoop it up, it's gonna look as though it's part of the water, okay? It's mixed in. It's not, you can't easily separate the two. They're together. There are other small plants, duckweed, things like that grow in the water. Those are fine. Those are not what we're worried about here. It's the blue-green algae that really kind of becomes part of it. And per the name, it can be blue, it can be green, it can be somewhere in between. And what the issue is these toxins that the bacteria release can cause digestive issues, headaches, coughing, sore throats. In severe reactions, we're looking at seizures, potential organ failures, and things like that. Dogs are especially susceptible. So this exposure can cause skin irritation just by having it on your skin. But really, you need to ingest it to have these really detrimental issues. And that's why it is so bad for dogs and kids, okay? So if you've got a kid and you've taken them swimming, they don't always close their mouths, they don't always close their eyes, right? Especially your youngest kids. You can imagine how it gets ingested, right? Dogs, even worse. I mean, my dog plays in a lake, he's like got his mouth open, he's drinking water like as he's swimming. But then they also will clean their coats off after they're out of the water. So they're actively ingesting any of this if it gets into their coat, okay? So that's why dogs are really susceptible. And, I feel like once a summer or so, you'll see a story about a dog who died after swimming in a lake or a pond with blue-green algae. So what do? First of all, you avoid it. You try to stay away from it. So check the DNR reports on public lakes, especially late summer. I'll show you the DNR page here in just a second. If you think you've encountered it, wash your body right away. Soap and water as soon as you're done in the water, hose off your dog, use some soap with it, shower right away after you've been exposed. But let's see if I can pop over and show let's look at the DNR page here. So the Indiana Department of Natural Resources is where you should check. They have a whole page dedicated to blue-green algae blooms on public land, okay? So if you are frequenting a private lake or pond or river, it's most common on lakes and ponds because of the water not moving, but it can happen on rivers as well. But if you're at a public one, check the DNR page. If you're on private, then you need to talk to whatever the governing body is of that area and ask them if they're doing any monitoring. But the DNR posts this for their levels. So it's a red, orange, yellow, blue guidance system for any lakes that have any of this bacteria present. So right now, this was updated August 26th, which I guess has been a couple weeks. There are no beaches that are currently closed for red levels. We've got 2 that are in the orange level, which means you can still swim and boat, but they're telling you children and those with compromised immune systems should not swim, and you should avoid the contact with algae, okay? Avoid swallowing water. Don't, take a bath or a shower afterwards. Don't use the lake water for cooking or bathing. Hopefully you're not using lake water for cooking ever. So keep pets out of the water and along the shallow banks and shorelines. The blue-green algae will also congregate in like pockets along shorelines, especially if you have maybe a little cove towards the back where the wind blows. That's where it's going to congregate. So Wabash State Park and Lincoln State Park both have 2 right now under the orange level. Yellow level, meaning swimming and boating are permitted. They're not specifically telling you to keep your kids out of the water, but they are still telling you to keep your dogs out of the water. And there's a huge list here, and some that I know that those of us in central Indiana frequent, Raccoon Lake, a couple on Lake Monroe, Patoka Lake, and then some more on the blue level, Pokagon. So it's a pretty common issue that pops up in the summertime, especially late summer when the water levels are warm and runoff is high. So one last plant, and then we'll move on to some animals. Ragweed, very, very common right now, especially late summer. We're kind of in prime ragweed season at the moment. Reaction severity is usually pretty mild, the exception being those who have asthma or other breathing issues can have some problems with this. So ragweed's pollen is mostly responsible for your fall seasonal allergies, your hay fever in the fall. There are certainly other things. And for the most of us, some over-the-counter, your Claritin, Zyrtec is enough, maybe Benadryl if it's really bothering you. But there are some that have more severe reactions to it. And goldenrod is often blamed for ragweed. Okay, so that's why I put goldenrod up there so that you can see the difference. And the problem is ragweed's flowers are what you see in those pictures down there. They're not showy, they're not pretty. They have a heck of a lot of pollen that causes issues, but they're not really, you don't notice them if you're walking by. And we've got a couple different kinds of ragweed, and it is common, it's all over the place. But goldenrod blooms at the same time and has these beautiful yellow showy flowers, and you'll see it in the same habitats, the same kind of environments. So a lot of people will start to feel the allergies, see the goldenrod, and make the association between the two and assume that goldenrod is the problem. So won't spend a lot of time on ragweed, but especially given the time that we're doing this webinar, I wanted to make sure to point that one out because it is an issue. All right, let's get into animals with everybody's favorite one to ask me about. I'd say that one of the most common concerns I get from people is, do you have any venomous snakes? Or sometimes people say poisonous snakes, but the appropriate term is venomous. Your chances of encountering a venomous snake in central Indiana are very low, okay? Again, other places, that is gonna be different. If you're watching this a few counties south of Boone County where I am, your chances of encountering a venomous snake are still pretty low, but higher, okay? But here in Boone County, where Zionsville is, we have no recognized breeding populations of any venomous snakes. They do not live in Boone County. They're not far away, but they are not well established in any of the surrounding counties right here. okay? You go south of Indianapolis towards Morgan, Monroe, Brown County, those counties in that area, the numbers go up. That's when you get into some of the territories of these. Indiana only has 4 species of venomous snakes to begin with. There are only 2, both of which are on this picture or on this slide, that you have almost any chance of encountering: northern copperhead and the timber rattlesnake. The other 2 are the Massasauga and the cottonmouth, also known as the water moccasin. Massasauga lives in a small pocket in northeastern Indiana in swamps up there, but very, very rare. And the cottonmouth, or water moccasin as they're often known, has not been seen in Indiana in like over 20 years. It's probably extinct from Indiana, or extirpated. They do start popping up, southern Illinois, southern Missouri, those areas, but generally not common here. But if you were going to find one, it would be extreme southern Indiana. But northern copperheads, decently common in southern Indiana. Timber rattlers, not as common, but Brown County is a spot that they really love, and that's, it's a good spot for hiking. So let's talk about venomous snakes. Again, your chances of encountering them, low. Your reaction severity is potentially severe, especially if it's left untreated. Okay, so why would we need to worry about a venomous snake? Is it gonna come seek me out? Is it gonna come bite me? In general, no. Most snakes are not very aggressive and will only bite in defense. So the way a snake bite typically happens for most people is they step on one, and the snake reacts, I think fairly reasonably by biting in defense. Okay, that is their defense. That's how they defend themselves. The one exception of a snake that can be a little bit more aggressive and kind of not seek people out, but like will bite a little more readily, is the northern water snake, which is not venomous, but they are very common, especially along our creeks and lakes. Excuse me. And they're often confused with the copperhead, which is in the upper left. Water snakes can also have a variety of color patterns. So this one's kind of a brownish olivey color in that picture, but I've seen them tinged orange a bit more, brownish, a little bit closer to the copperhead color. So they are often mistaken for copperheads, and they will bite a little bit more readily than some of our other snakes, but again, they're non-venomous. So how do you identify these 2 venomous snakes that you may or may not see? The copperhead has what we call a Hershey kiss pattern, and you can see it a little bit in this picture, but you can look on the sides and they have it looks like little brown Hershey kiss shapes. They have a triangular shaped head. Both the timber rattler and the copperhead have that. And they like hilly, rocky areas. So, avoid them by staying on marked trails, wear boots while you're hiking. Don't be out hiking in snake country in sandals. I'm guilty of that one though sometimes. But also remember that, most snakes don't want to bite you. And even if they do bite you, a venomous snake can control how much venom it releases at once, and it takes a while for them to regenerate their venom. So they don't want to release the venom if they don't have to. So often a venomous snake will do what we call a dry bite. So they would bite, but not inject any venom unless they kept being threatened. And then finally they would release the venom to really ward off whatever the threat was. The exception to this can be when they're young, because they don't have as much control over the venom release yet. So if you are bitten by a venomous snake in Indiana, seek medical attention right away, right? If you can get a picture of a snake that bit you, take a picture of it. Don't try to take the snake, don't try to grab the snake, don't do anything with the snake, because you're risking getting bitten again. Take a picture and then go seek medical attention right away. Do not try to suck out the venom. Do not try to cut out the venom. Don't try to apply a tourniquet. That is all issues that might cause a problem. If you're wearing rings or a watch, take those off of, wherever it cut. If it bit you on the arm, if you bit you on the leg, take any restricting things off your leg, because you might swell, and then go seek medical attention. These 2 snakes, they do have venom that can be potentially really bad if you're left untreated, but they can be treated. Other parts of the world, there are much, much, much more dangerous snakes that you treat in different ways. So that's here in Indiana, these couple potentially dangerous snakes. If you see a venomous snake, just give it some space, walk around it. It does not want to hurt you. It doesn't